Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. Today we are looking at May 25th, a date when humanity repeatedly discovered that the universe, government, technology, and basic human decency all come with warning labels. And naturally, we read them after the explosion. Segment 1 and broom stars and holy paperwork. May 25th begins with people staring at the sky, reading omens, and then immediately making it everybody else's problem. In 240 BC, Chinese astronomers recorded a strange broom star in the heavens, the first confirmed written appearance of what we now call Halley's Comet. At the time, nobody was saying, yes, orbital mechanics. They were saying, great, the sky has a tail now. Somebody's dynasty is about to get audited by heaven. The irony is that ancient record keepers working without telescopes, computers, or a smug guy on the internet saying, actually, preserve the evidence that later helped Edmund Halley prove comets were not divine jump scares, but predictable objects obeying gravity. That is the long arc of science. We start by blaming the king for a glowing space broom and end by sending a probe into it to confirm it is basically a frozen dirt clump with branding. Then, in 1521, Emperor Charles V issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Martin Luther an outlaw after Luther refused to retract his attacks on church authority. A document meant to crush one monk ended up becoming the kind of overreach that turns a complaint department into a revolution. Luther was legally branded a heretic. His books were banned, and anyone sheltering him was forbidden from helping him, which is exactly how you tell every rebellious German prince, please make this your personality. He escaped to Wartburg Castle, translated the New Testament into German, and proved that nothing spreads an idea faster than powerful men loudly trying to make sure nobody reads it. So in one corner, a comet teaches humans the universe is lawful. In another, an imperial decree teaches rulers that banning a movement is sometimes the best free advertising package available. Segment 2 and cities taken, governments invented. The next pattern is power discovering that maps are just wish lists with soldiers attached. In 1085, Alfonso VI of Castile entered Toledo after a long siege, taking one of the great Muslim cities of Iberia and pushing Christian power deep into the Tagus Basin. This was not just a medieval real estate closing with chainmail. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Toledo had been a major center of Islamic rule, Jewish life, and preserved scholarship. And its fall terrified the remaining rulers of Al-Andalus so much that they invited the Almoravids from North Africa to intervene. That is how one conquest creates the next crisis, because history loves dominoes but hates cleanup. Yet Toledo also became a translation hub, where Arabic libraries helped move Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and Islamic science into Latin Europe. So yes, the conquest was brutal, strategic, and destabilizing, but also accidentally turned the city into a medieval data transfer cable wearing a helmet. Then, in 1787, George Washington presided over the opening of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where delegates were technically sent to revise the Articles of Confederation and immediately began quietly planning to replace the whole system. That is American government's origin story. A meeting scheduled for repairs that became a full renovation while nobody outside was allowed to see the blueprints. They put dirt on the streets to muffle carriage noise, kept the debate secret, and argued through the heat over representation, executive power, state sovereignty, and slavery. Washington's presence gave the gathering legitimacy, even though it was flirting heavily with bloodless political coup energy. Both Toledo and Philadelphia show power at a hinge point. One city absorbed by conquest, one nation rebuilt behind closed doors. In both cases, the official story sounds noble, but the machinery underneath is messy, anxious, and held together with compromise, calculation, and the historical equivalent of duct tape. Segment 3 and wires, wheels, and space wizards. May 25th also has a habit of speeding everything up until society gets motion sickness. In 1844, the Baltimore Patriot published the first news dispatch transmitted by telegraph. One day after Samuel Morse sent "What Hath God Wrought" from Washington to Baltimore. Before that, news traveled at the speed of a horse, a train, or a guy with bad handwriting and a satchel. Suddenly, politics could move through wires, and journalism entered the age of, "We just heard this, so print it before anyone understands it." The telegraph did not merely make communication faster, it changed the style of news itself, pushing reports to become shorter, sharper, and more standardized because every word cost money. Basically, the 19th century invented the expensive text message and immediately used it to cover Congress. Then, in 1927, Henry Ford announced the end of Model T production, closing the chapter on the car that brought mass automobile ownership to working Americans. The Model T had transformed transportation, factories, roads, suburbs, and the national imagination. But Ford clung to it long after consumers wanted style, colors, comfort, and the radical new idea of not driving the same black box forever. General Motors figured out that people do not just buy function, they buy identity, insecurity, and cup holders before cup holders existed. Ford had mastered production, then nearly lost the market by assuming desire would remain standardized. And in 1977, George Lucas's Star Wars opened in theaters, turning a weird space opera into the modern summer blockbuster. Lucas thought it might fail, fled to Hawaii, and accidentally created the franchise economy while trying not to have a panic attack. The telegraph shrank distance, the Model T reshaped space, and Star Wars turned movie-going into mythology with merchandise. May 25th is where communication, transportation, and entertainment all learn the same lesson. Once the machine gets faster, the public does not ask whether it should slow down. It asks if there is a sequel, a payment plan, and a lunchbox. Segment 4, and the modern world breaks its own toys. The 20th century, on May 25th, is where modernity starts looking less like progress and more like a lab experiment with funding. In 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres ended after Germany had introduced chlorine gas on a massive scale, sending a toxic cloud into Allied trenches, and proving that even trench warfare, already a nightmare with mud, rats, artillery, and generals who treated maps like fantasy football, could still get worse. The gas caused horrific deaths and injuries, and although it failed to deliver a decisive German breakthrough, it opened the door to chemical warfare as a regular feature of World War I. That is mankind's dark gift. We can look at a battlefield and say, this lacks respiratory trauma. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and called for landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. The United States had barely managed a brief suborbital flight. The Bay of Pigs had just embarrassed the administration, and the Soviet Union had put Yuri Gagarin into orbit. So naturally, the solution was to say, fine, we are going to the moon. It was vision, yes, but also Cold War optics wearing a space helmet. That speech unleashed the Apollo program, a massive national mobilization that accelerated rocketry, computing, engineering, and American self-confidence. Then, in 1963, 32 independent African nations formed the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, trying to build continental solidarity after colonial powers had spent generations carving borders like drunk butchers with flags. The OAU gave newly independent states a forum and a shared anti-colonial mission, though its principle of non-interference would later limit its ability to confront abuses inside member states. These events sit together because they show the modern world's contradiction. The same century that industrialized poison gas also reached for the moon and built new diplomatic structures after empire. We are a species capable of genius and catastrophe, often in the same budget cycle. Segment 5, and fame, justice, and the crowd watching. Finally, May 25th reminds us that public life can turn people into symbols faster than it can treat them as human beings. In 1895, Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor after Victorian Britain decided that the author of The Importance of Being Earnest was dangerous enough to destroy, but not dangerous enough to stop buying theater tickets from until the scandal got too hot. His failed libel suit against the Marquess of Queensberry opened the door to prosecution, humiliation, imprisonment, and exile. Wilde's downfall exposed the cruelty of a society that loved wit, beauty, and performance right up until they came attached to a forbidden private life. In 1922, Babe Ruth was suspended and fined for throwing dirt on an umpire, a much smaller moral crisis, but a useful reminder that celebrity has always been one part talent, one part spectacle, and one part adult supervision failure. The league had to discipline its biggest star to prove the rules still applied, which is adorable considering modern sports scandals now require legal teams, sponsors, and a documentary crew. In 1935, Jesse Owens broke or tied 6 world records in 45 minutes at Ann Arbor while carrying the burdens of segregation, work, family, and injury. His performance was athletic brilliance, compressed into less time than most of us spend arguing with a streaming app. And it set the stage for his triumph at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And in 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin during an arrest over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. A teenager's cell phone video cut through the official language and forced the world to witness what had happened. The protest that followed became one of the largest movements in American history, demanding accountability in a system designed to avoid it. Wilde, Ruth, Owens, and Floyd are not equivalent stories, but they all reveal the crowd watching, judging, cheering, punishing, or finally refusing to look away. Fame can magnify greatness, cruelty can become policy, and sometimes one recorded moment can break through the fog of official excuses. In conclusion, May 25th is a reminder that history does not move in a straight line. It streaks across the sky like a comet, hides in secret conventions, races through wires, rolls off assembly lines, launches into space, and sometimes lands in the street, where somebody with a phone forces the world to pay attention. The pattern is not that humanity always gets better. The pattern is that we keep building systems powerful enough to reveal exactly who we are.